The December wind howled through the narrow streets of Boston, chasing dry leaves and flurries of snow across the stone sidewalks. Inside the Reynolds mansion, heat shimmered from tall fireplaces, but Mason Reynolds wasn't interested in warmth or the rules his father set like iron gates around his life. 8 years old and dressed still in his private school uniform, he crept down the marble staircase, his polished shoes muffled by the ornate carpet. His dog, Rover, a golden retriever with fur like spun sunlight, padded beside him, tail swishing. With anticipation, Mason glanced toward the tall doors of his father's study, listening for footsteps, for the deep, commanding voice that always seemed to smother him. Hearing only silence, he pulled the side door open and slipped into the evening, cold air biting at his cheeks. Rover bounded ahead, leaping happily through the wrought iron gates that marked the mansion's boundary. Freedom was sharp and sweet on Mason's tongue. The air outside didn't tell him what time to go to bed or what not to touch. His father's voice couldn't reach him here. He jogged down Beacon Hill's polished streets, watching Christmas lights flicker in townhouse windows, each one glowing with families who seemed warmer, closer, freer than his own. Rover barked at a passing snowflake, snapping at it as if it were a butterfly. Mason laughed, and for a moment, all the weight of being William Reynolds' son slipped away. But as the street stretched on, the grand door faded, polished brick gave way to worn stone, and the neat rows of houses turned into weathered buildings with cracked steps and darkened windows. Mason slowed, suddenly aware of how far he had wandered. Snow fell more heavily now, catching on his lashes, dusting Rover's fur. That's when he saw her. A small figure sat hunched against a cold brick wall, half hidden in the shadows between two shuttered shops. Her legs were drawn close, thin arms wrapped tightly around herself, as if she were trying to disappear into the stone. The crutches leaned against the wall beside her, their metal frames scratched and worn. Mason stopped, Rover's ears perking forward. The girl looked up, startled. She couldn't be older than him, maybe younger, her face pale beneath streaks of dirt, her blonde hair tangled into knots. But it was her eyes that froze him in place, blue, clear and defiant, though rimmed with exhaustion. She didn't look weak, not entirely. She looked like someone who had been fighting the world for far too long. "Are you okay?" Mason asked, his voice soft but carrying in the empty street. "I'm fine," the girl muttered, trying to push herself up with trembling arms. Her thin legs wobbled, the crutches clattering as though even standing was a battle. She caught herself, straightened her back, and lifted her chin as though daring him to believe she needed help. Mason shifted awkwardly, tugging Rover's leash to keep him still. "I'm Mason," he said after a pause, his breath clouding in the frigid air. "What's your name?" The girl hesitated, then answered, "Emma." Her voice was rough, like she hadn't used it much lately. She glanced down at Rover, who sniffed her hand gently and wagged his tail, offering her the kind of welcome she wasn't used to. For the first time, a small, reluctant smile flickered across her lips. "Your dog is pretty. He likes you," Mason said quickly, eager to stretch the fragile moment. He took a step closer. "You shouldn't sit in the snow. You'll get sick. Where you live?" Emma's smile faded, her eyes shifting away, avoiding his. "Round," she said vaguely, pulling her knees tighter. Mason frowned, his young heart tugged by something he didn't fully understand. He thought of the grand kitchen back home, the tray of cookies Mrs. Peterson always left on the counter. "Are you hungry?" The words tumbled out before he could stop them. "We have cookies at my house." Emma's head snapped up, suspicion flashing in her eyes. "I can't walk that far," she said, glancing at her crutches. "I'll help you," Mason replied with sudden determination, his voice firm in a way it rarely was. "It's not that far." Emma studied him for a long moment, snowflakes gathering in her tangled hair. The sky was darkening, shadows stretching across the street. She shivered, her thin coat no match for the December cold. Finally, with a reluctant sigh, she whispered, "Okay." Mason beamed, stepping forward to steady her as she fumbled for her crutches. She leaned on him once, just briefly, when her arms trembled from the effort. He noticed then a glimmer of silver at her collar, a thin chain slipping out for only a second before she tucked it back inside. He thought it looked nice, but didn't say anything. His mind was full of the thought of getting her warm, getting her safe, together, with Rover trotting happily beside them. The children began the long walk back toward the mansion. Mason's small hand steadied Emma's shoulder. his determination burning brighter than the lights twinkling in the frosty distance. Neither of them knew that this walk through the falling snow was the first step toward uncovering a truth that would shatter and rebuild their lives forever. Asterisk, the snow crunched beneath Mason's shoes as he guided Emma slowly along the uneven pavement, Rover trotting faithfully by their side. Each step seemed to echo in the stillness of the evening, the cold air sharp against their skin. Emma's crutches sank into the snow, leaving narrow impressions beside Mason's quick, boyish footprints. She moved cautiously, her thin arms trembling under the weight of her body, but every time she stumbled, she refused to let out more than a muffled grunt. Mason noticed, though, and without hesitation, he offered his small shoulder for her to lean on. "You don't have to help me," Emma whispered, her voice carrying both pride and weariness. "Yes, I do," Mason said with the certainty only an 8-year-old could muster. "Friends help each other, and I decided you're my friend." Emma glanced at him then, a flicker of something unreadable crossing her eyes, suspicion, disbelief, maybe even longing. She tightened her grip on the crutch handles and nodded faintly, as though agreeing not with him, but with herself. As they neared the mansion, the skyline seemed to swallow them whole. The Reynolds estate loomed like a shadowy fortress at the end of Beacon Hill, its tall iron gates glinting with frost, its windows glowing like golden eyes. Emma froze in place, her crutches digging deep into the snow. "You live there?" she asked, awe and fear tangled in her tone. "Yeah," Mason said, almost dismissively, to him. The mansion was normal, a cage he'd grown used to. To Emma, it was another world. Her blue eyes widened, reflecting the shimmering lights. "It looked like a castle. It's too big," Mason shrugged, tugging Rover's leash. "Too many rules." "Too quiet. You'll see." Emma's lips parted as if to protest, but the warm spilling from the kitchen window pulled her forward, weakening her resolve. Still, she hesitated at the gates, the weight of her worn shoes on the snow making her feel she didn't belong. Inside, Mrs. Peterson was dusting the chandeliers when the back door creaked open. She turned, her feathered duster pausing midair, and gasped, "Master Mason." Her sharp voice cut through the kitchen. "Where on earth have you?" She stopped cold, her eyes falling on Emma, who stood just inside the doorway, hunched and shivering, clutching her crutches as though ready to flee. "Good heavens, child, this is Emma," Mason announced, puffing out his chest like a small knight defending his companion. "She's my friend. She's hungry. Can we get cookies?" "Cookies?" Mrs. Peterson's eyes darted from the dirt smudge across Emma's face to the raw red patches on her hands. "Master Mason, your father would." "Asterisk, please," Mason interrupted, his voice softer now, urgent. He stepped in front of Emma, as though shielding her from judgment. "She needs help." Mrs. Peterson's stern mouth quivered, her hands trembling around the duster. Finally, with a sigh, she set it down. "Sit her by the fire. I'll fetch something warm." Emma's crutches clicked against the marble floor as Mason guided her toward the parlor. The heat of the roaring fire wrapped around her fragile frame, thawing the chill from her skin. She stared into the flames as though hypnotized, her eyes glistening. "You're safe now," Mason said firmly, watching her closely for the first time. Emma's hand lifted to her collar, tugging the thin silver chain nervously. The small pendant slipped briefly into view, catching the firelight with a flash of sapphire at its center. Mason noticed, but thought nothing of it. It was just jewelry, something plenty of people wore. To Emma, though, it seemed like a shield, a secret too heavy for her small body to carry. She tucked it quickly back under her shirt. Before Mason could ask, the heavy creak of the front door echoed through the house. Rover barked once, ears alert. Mason's face paled. "Dad's home early," he whispered, panic rising in his chest. The sound of footsteps filled the hallway, measured, commanding, the stride of a man who expected the world to obey. William Reynolds appeared in the doorway, tall and broad-shouldered, his tailored coat dusted with snow. His gaze swept over the room and landed on Mason. "Mason," he said, his voice low but edged with steel, "what have you done this time?" Mason swallowed hard, but before he could answer, William's eyes shifted to Emma for a heartbeat. His expression was unreadable. Then his gaze dropped, caught by the glimmer of silver at her neck. The sapphire pendant had slipped free again, resting against her chest. The briefcase in his hand slipped, crashing to the floor with a dull thud. Paper spilled across the carpet. But William didn't notice, his face drained of color, his eyes wide with disbelief. Emma clutched the pendant instinctively, her hand trembling. "It's mine." she said quickly, her voice defensive, almost frightened. William's knees buckled as if struck. He staggered forward, dropping into a crouch. Before her, his polished shoes sinking into the carpet. His hand lifted, shaking, then dropped again as though the air itself had burned him. Where did you get that necklace? He whispered, his voice breaking in a way Mason had never heard before. Emma's eyes narrowed. I've always had it, she said, her chin lifting defiantly. William's lips parted, his breath ragged. Mason stood frozen, staring at his father, this man who never cried, never faltered, reduced to a trembling shadow by the sight of a homeless girl's pendant. Something unspoken filled the room, a tension that made even the fire crackle more. Softly, Mason didn't understand it, not yet, but in that moment, the world he knew tilted dangerously, and he realized that Emma wasn't just another girl in the snow. She was a piece of a secret his father had buried so deep, it threatened to unravel everything. Asterisk, the silence in the parlor pressed down like a heavy blanket. Even Rover, usually restless and wagging, lowered himself to the rug with a whimper, as though sensing the tension hanging in the air. The only sound was the fire's steady crackle, the flames throwing dancing shadows across William Reynolds's face. He knelt before Emma, his broad shoulders hunched in a way that Mason had never seen. His father was always a figure of authority, polished, controlled, untouchable. But now, staring at the little girl clutching her sapphire pendant, he looked as though the ground beneath him had given way. Emma's hand trembled where it covered the necklace. Her knuckles were white, her chin lifted in the stubborn tilt that dared him to challenge her. For a child so fragile, leaning on crutches, she radiated a defiance that startled Mason. It was as if the world had stripped everything from her, except this small piece of silver, and her fierce was to protect it. William's voice cracked. That pendant, it belonged to... He stopped, his words dissolving into a whisper Mason couldn't catch. He tried again, but his throat seemed to close around the name he couldn't say. His eyes filled with something Mason had never seen. There before fear. Dad, Mason's voice was small, unsure. He took a step forward, confused and frightened by the change in his father. What's wrong? She's just my friend. She was cold, and I'm upstairs, Mason. William's voice was sharp, but not angry, desperate. His hands were shaking, his jaw tight. Now. But Dad, now. Mason froze, his heart pounding. He had seen his father angry before, seen him stern and commanding, but never like this. This was different. This was raw. Reluctantly, Mason turned toward the stairs, but he couldn't resist one last glance over his shoulder. Emma's blue eyes had locked with William's, and neither looked away. It was as if they were speaking some unspoken language Mason couldn't understand. At the top of the staircase, Mason lingered in the shadows, peering down through the railing. He couldn't bring himself to leave. Something was happening, something enormous, and he needed to know. Down below, William reached out, his hand hovering inches from Emma's necklace. Please, he said quietly, his voice trembling. Let me see it. Emma flinched back, pressing the pendant tighter against her chest. No, it's mine. I'm not trying to take it, William said quickly, pain etched across his face. I just need to see to know if it's real. His eyes were glistening now, his carefully built armor cracking with every word. That necklace was made for only one person, my daughter. Emma's breath hitched. She blinked at him, her stubborn mask wavering for just a moment. Your daughter? Her voice was quiet, uncertain. William swallowed hard, his lips parting as though to speak again, but his body betrayed him. He sat back on his heels, his hands gripping his knees as he closed his eyes. Memory searched hospital rooms, smoke-filled nights, a frantic search that ended in despair. The image of a little girl with golden hair and a smile like sunlight haunted him, a ghost he had buried under the weight of work and silence. Emma's small frame shifted uneasily in the chair. She didn't understand why this stranger, this man with perfect shoes and eyes, that mirrored her own, looked at her, as though she were both a miracle and a curse. Who are you really? William whispered, his voice breaking. I told you, Emma said, her chin rising again in defense. I'm Emma. William's gaze locked on hers. In her eyes, he saw fragments of someone he had loved and lost, someone he thought was gone forever, but he also saw years of pain, of hunger, of battles fought alone on streets no child should ever have walked. Upstairs, Mason gripped the railing so tightly his fingers ached. His father's words echoed in his ears, sending a shiver down his spine. Daughter, The word was heavy, impossible. What had clung to Mason's mind like a secret he wasn't ready to believe. Suddenly, the front door opened again. The cold night. Air swept in as James, the family's butler, returned from an errand. He stopped short at the sight. Before him the powerful William Reynolds on his knees. Before a ragged girl clutching a necklace like her life depended on it. His eyes widened. "Sir." William shot him a look so fierce that James faltered mid-step. "Not a word," William said, his tone dangerously low. "Not one word." James bowed his head quickly, retreating into silence. But his expression revealed the truth. Whatever was unfolding in that parlor was far greater than a boy bringing home a lost child. Emma's hand shifted against the necklace, her fingers brushing the tiny clasp at the back. For a second, Mason thought she might remove it, reveal the pendant fully. Instead, she clutched it tighter, her voice trembling as she spoke. "I don't know what you're talking about. I don't know you." And with that, the fire flared, a log collapsing into embers. Shadows leapt higher on the walls, wrapping the room in a haunting glow. William lowered his head, his shoulders shaking, a sound escaping him that Mason had never heard before, a broken sob. Mason's world tilted. Again, his father, the man who never cried, was crying now for a girl Mason had found in the snow. A girl who might be more than she seemed, a girl who might change everything. Asterisk, the fire had burned low, its embers pulsing like a heartbeat in the quiet parlor. Emma sat stiffly in the velvet chair, her thin hands gripping the crutches that leaned against her knees, ready to spring away at the first sign of danger. Her eyes darted between William, still crouched before her, and the door behind him. The only escape route in this strange mansion. She didn't trust this man, not with the way his eyes bore into hers, not with the way his voice cracked when he spoke of daughters and necklaces. She had been around long enough to know that people could look kind one moment and turn cruel the next. William pressed a trembling hand to his face, dragging it down slowly as though trying to ground himself. In reality, when he finally spoke, his words carried the weight of years buried under silence. 6 years ago, his voice faltered, but he pushed on. 6 years ago, I lost a child, my little girl. He swallowed hard, the sound thick in his throat. Her name was Emma too. Emma stiffened at the word, her blue eyes widening, though she quickly tried to hide her reaction. "Lots of people are named Emma," she muttered, her voice guarded. William's gaze sharpened. "Not with that necklace." His hand shook as he gestured to the silver chain glinting faintly in the firelight. "That pendant belonged to my wife. She had it made when our daughter was born." Inside, his voice cracked again, his eyes misting over. Inside is a photo of her as a baby. Emma's fingers curled tightly around the pendant, her pulse hammering. She had never opened it. She didn't know it could open. It had always been there, as long as she could remember. The one thing she clung to when the world grew too cold and cruel. Mason, still hidden on the staircase, leaned forward until the wood dug into his cheek. His heart pounded in his ears. His father had never spoken like this, not to him, not to anyone. He had always been the man of rules and silence, not of broken whispers about the past. Mason wanted to run down, to shout questions, but fear glued him to the shadows. William's breath grew ragged, memories rushing through him like ghosts clawing their way to the surface. "It was a fire," he said finally, his words barely above a whisper. "A fire that tore through the summer house. My wife, she didn't survive." His voice cracked, raw with grief. "And my little girl, she was gone. We searched for months, for years. Nothing. They said she died that night, too. I buried an empty coffin." Emma's throat tightened, her small hands trembling. Images flickered at the edge of her memory, orange flames licking the walls. A woman's voice, screaming her name. Strong arms wrapping her in a blanket before everything went dark. She had woken later in strange hands, strangers' voices, then darkness again. She had stopped asking questions a long time ago because nobody had answers. But now this man was staring at her as if she were the answer to every prayer he had ever whispered into the void. "I don't remember," Emma whispered, her voice shaking. "I don't remember that. I don't remember you. You were only 2, William said, his voice breaking with desperation. "How could you remember? But I remember. I see her in your face. I see her in your eyes." His hand lifted again, trembling. But he stopped himself short of touching her, afraid she might vanish like smoke. "You're her. You're my daughter." Emma's eyes filled with tears she fought to hold back. She wanted to deny it, to shove his words away. But something deep inside her stirred something she had buried beneath hunger and cold nights, and the sharp edges of survival. She wanted to believe. She hated that she wanted to believe. Then William's phone buzzed sharply from his coat pocket, slicing through the fragile moment. He fumbled it out, his hand shaking as he glanced at the caller ID, his lawyer. He hesitated, then declined the call, but Mason, from above, caught the flicker of fear on his father's face. His father was always in control, always ahead, but not now. "Why are you scared?" Emma asked suddenly, narrowing her eyes. She saw it clearly, the dread in his eyes, the weight pressing down on him. William blinked at her, stunned. "Because if I'm wrong, if you're not her," his voice cracked, raw, "then I've lost her all over again." The words sank deep into Emma's chest, heavier than the necklace she clutched, upstairs. Mason's small hands trembled against the railing. He had always thought of his father as unshakable, a man who didn't bend, who didn't cry, who didn't need anyone. But now, watching from the shadows, he saw something else, a man haunted by loss. Crumbling at the sight of a little girl who might be his blood, the fire popped, a log splitting and sending sparks into the air. Emma jumped at the sound, her grip tightening on her crutches. William leaned closer, his voice desperate, almost pleading. "Emma, please, let me open the locket. Let me see the picture inside." Just once, Emma hesitated, her chest rising and falling rapidly. The pendant felt like a part of her, the only part of her that had ever been hers. The idea of handing it over even for a second terrified her. But deep down, a small voice whispered that maybe the truth was hidden inside all along. Her lips parted, but before she could answer, the creak of the staircase betrayed Mason's hiding place. William's head snapped up, his eyes locking with his son's wide, fearful gaze. "Mason," he said softly, his voice raw with emotion, "come down here." And in that moment, the boy realized he was about to learn a secret that would change not only Emma's life, but his own forever. Mason's small footsteps echoed on the grand staircase as he descended, his heart thudding louder than the creaks of the old wood. He wasn't sure if he was walking into trouble or into something far stranger, but the look in his father's eyes, wet, trembling, filled with the kind of terror he'd never seen, told him that the world he thought he knew was already unraveling. Rover padded down behind him, ears perked, tail low, as though even the golden retriever sensed the storm building in the room. William Reynolds turned back toward Emma, his jaw clenched tight as though holding back words that threatened to shatter him. Mason reached the bottom step and stopped, uncertain. Emma's blue eyes shifted toward him, and in them he saw the same confusion, the same fear, but also a silent plea. "Don't leave me alone with this." "Sit, Mason," William said, gesturing to the chair across from Emma. His tone was calm, but beneath it ran a current of urgency. "There are things you need to understand." Mason slid into the chair, his eyes flicking nervously between his father and Emma. "Dad," he whispered, "you're scaring her." William's gaze softened slightly at his son's words, but his voice stayed firm. "I'm scaring myself too." He let out a slow breath, then looked at Emma again. "If what I believe is true, this changes everything, but I can't rely on hope alone. We need proof." "Proof," Emma repeated, clutching her pendant. Her voice quivered. "What kind of proof?" "DNA," William said bluntly. "A test." "Blood doesn't lie." Emma's body stiffened. The word test made her think of hospitals, needles, strange faces. She shook her head, her grip on the crutches tightening. "No, I'm not doing that. I don't need anyone poking me with needles just because you think I look like someone." Mason frowned, leaning forward. "But Emma, if it proves you're my sister." He hesitated, the word foreign on his tongue, heavy with wonder. "Then you won't have to sleep outside anymore. You'll have a room here, toys, food. You'll be safe." Emma turned her face away, shame flickering in her eyes. Safe. It was a word she hadn't trusted in years. Safety always came with strings, with people who wanted something in return. William saw the fear hardening in her posture. "I won't force you," he said, his voice low, almost fragile, "but I will find out the truth. If not through you, then through what's left of the past. Records, witnesses. Someone out there knows what happened that night." Mason watched him closely, confused. That night? William's jaw tightened. He had never spoken of it to his son, not once. He had buried that part of himself so deep it felt like digging into his own grave to unearth it. Now, he turned toward Mason, his voice heavy. The night of the fire, the night we lost her. His eyes flicked back to Emma. The night I lost you. Emma's breath caught in her throat, and Mason's eyes widened. He had always known his mother had died tragically, but the whispers about a baby sister had been nothing more than rumors. He overheard when grown-ups thought he wasn't listening. His father had shut down every question with icy silence, until now. William rose to his feet, his tall frame looming in the flickering light. He pulled out his phone and dialed quickly. "Anderson," he said when the call connected. His voice shifted into the sharp, commanding tone of a man who ran empires. "Find me every file, every police report, every hospital record from the summer house fire. I want the truth, all of it, tonight." He ended the call abruptly, his hand trembling as he slid the phone back into his pocket. For the first time in years, William Reynolds wasn't thinking of business deals or board meetings. He was thinking of ghosts, of a tiny coffin lowered into the earth with nothing inside, of a mistake that had hollowed him out and left him a shell of the man he might have been. Emma shifted uneasily, feeling the weight of his stare. "Why do you even care?" she blurted, her voice sharp to hide the crack in it. "You're rich. You have a big house, servants, everything. Why do you want me?" William flinched as if struck. "Because if you are who I think you are," he said slowly, painfully, "then I failed you once, and I will not fail you again." The room fell into silence. The fire popped, and snow tapped lightly against the tall windows. Mason's small voice broke the stillness. "I believe her," he said firmly, surprising even himself. "I don't need a test. She's my sister. I can feel it." Emma's eyes stung with tears she refused to let fall. No one had ever claimed her like that, not with such certainty, not with such love. William's face softened as he looked at his son, but inside, doubt still clawed at him. He needed more than feelings. He needed truth. From the corner of the room, Mrs. Peterson appeared silently, her face pale. She had overheard more than she should have. Her voice shook as she spoke. "Sir, if what you suspect is true, there are things you don't know. Things that were never told to the public about that night." William's head snapped toward her. "What do you mean?" Her hands twisted in her apron. "I shouldn't say, but I was there, sir. I saw things, heard things." Her eyes darted to Emma. "The fire, it wasn't an accident." Asterisk, the words dropped like a stone into the room, and for a moment, even the fire seemed to still. "Mason," gasped. Emma's breath caught, and William's face darkened with a fury that made his already powerful presence shake the air around him. If the fire wasn't an accident, then someone had stolen 6 years from his daughter. Someone had tried to erase her from existence, and now that ghost had walked back into his home, fragile but alive, carrying the one clue that could burn the whole truth into the light. The firelight had dimmed to a dull glow, painting the walls of the Reynolds mansion in flickering orange. The room felt like a cage filled with ghosts, every silence heavier than the last. William stood rigid before the hearth, his fists clenched at his sides, his eyes hard and distant. Mason sat near Emma, close enough that his shoulder brushed hers, as though his small body alone could protect her from whatever storm was brewing. Emma's crutches leaned against the chair, but she held herself upright, spine stiff, her fingers twisting nervously around the chain of her necklace. Mrs. Peterson's words still hung in the air like smoke. The fire wasn't an accident. William finally turned, his gaze fixed on the housekeeper. His voice was low, deadly calm. "Tell me everything you know, now." Mrs. Peterson hesitated, wringing her hands in the folds of her apron. "I heard arguments, sir, before the fire broke out. Not with your wife. She was in the nursery, soothing the baby. But there were strangers near the house that night, men who didn't belong. I thought they were part of the security team at first, but they weren't." William's jaw tightened, his breath slow and deliberate, like a man restraining a tidal wave. "You said nothing." "I tried, sir. I swear I did. But when the flames spread, when the chaos began, no one listened to a housekeeper's warnings." Her eyes fell, shame burning in her expression. Emma shifted uncomfortably. "You think someone wanted me gone?" Her voice was small, but there was steel under it. She looked between them, her sapphire eyes wide. "Why, I was just a baby." William crouched again, his large frame folding before her with the weight of a man who had built an empire, but failed his own blood. His voice cracked, raw. "Because of me, Emma, because of who I am. My success, my enemies, they saw you as leverage. I thought I could protect my family by building walls of power around us. But power draws wolves, His throat tightened. And that night, I wasn't there. I wasn't there when you needed me most. Emma's lips trembled, but she lifted her chin, refusing to cry. She had learned long ago that tears didn't change hunger or cold. Yet something in his words tugged at the faint, half-buried memories that lived inside her, the echo of a lullaby. The heat of fire, the terrifying absence of safety. The grandfather clock in the hall chimed, its solemn tone cutting through the air. At that moment, William's phone buzzed again on the mantel. He snatched it up, his voice gruff. Anderson. The pause was long, William's expression shifting as he listened. His face paled. He turned, his eyes locking on Emma. The DNA results are in. Mason leaned forward, his small fist clenched on his knees, and William swallowed hard. His voice shook as he spoke, every syllable echoing through the room like thunder. She's mine. She's my daughter. The words hit like a bolt of lightning. Mason gasped, his eyes wide, his chest filling with something that felt like both joy and awe. He turned to Emma, his face glowing. I knew it. I knew you were my sister. Emma froze, her heart thundering in her chest. She wanted to run, to deny it, to cling to the identity she had built in the shadows of the streets. But Mason's certainty, his absolute belief in her, broke something open inside her. Tears spilled down her cheeks before she could stop them. William's eyes softened, though his body trembled under the weight of truth. He reached out slowly, cautiously, as though afraid she might vanish again. I lost you once, he whispered. I will not lose you again. But before Emma could answer, Mrs. Peterson's voice cut through the fragile moment. Sir, she said, her tone urgent, her face pale with fear. If the fire wasn't an accident, then whoever said it might know she survived. If word spreads that she's back, the rest went unsaid. Danger, enemies, wolves that William had spent years keeping at bay. And now the daughter they thought had been erased was suddenly alive, sitting in his parlor, wearing the very necklace that tied her to him. William rose, his figure filling the room with a renewed authority, but not the cold, distant kind Mason was used to. This was different. This was a man sharpened by grief and reborn in fury. Then let them come, he said, his voice low and dangerous. This time, they'll face a father who knows what he stands to lose. Emma shivered, not just from fear, but from the weight of being wanted, truly wanted for the first time. She could remember. Mason slipped his hand into hers, his small fingers warm against her cold skin. You're not alone anymore, he whispered fiercely. You have me. You have us. Outside, snow began to fall harder, covering the city in white silence. But inside the Reynolds mansion, storms brewed. The truth had been uncovered. But the reckoning was only beginning. Asterisk, the snow outside hammered against the tall windows like a warning from the night. The storm building in strength as though the world itself sensed what was about to unfold. Inside the Reynolds mansion, the air was heavy, thick with truth newly uncovered and secrets still clawing their way to the surface. The DNA results had confirmed that Emma was William's daughter, Mason's sister, the child thought lost forever. But the revelation brought not peace, only a deeper unease. Because now that the truth was known, the past demanded to be faced. William sat at the edge of the armchair, elbows on his knees, staring at the pendant resting in Emma's trembling hands. That tiny silver heart had been the one link between her and the family she never knew. For years, it had been her shield, her anchor. Now, it was the final piece of proof. Open it, William whispered. His voice raw out. Emma shook her head, her small fingers clenching the chain. No, it's mine. It's the only thing I've ever had that was mine. If I open it, if I give it to you, then maybe you'll take it away too. Mason leaned forward quickly, his young face bright with conviction. Emma, he won't, I promise. That is everything, but that necklace, it belongs to you, always. Just let him see what's inside. Emma's sapphire eyes darted between them, the pleading warmth of Mason's gaze. The desperate grief etched into William's face. Slowly, painfully, she slid her thumbnail against the tiny clasp. The heart-shaped locket clicked, opening with a faint metallic side dot inside. Pressed behind the glass was a faded photograph, a baby wrapped in a blanket, smiling with eyes so blue they seemed to pierce through time itself, and beside the baby, a young woman, beautiful, radiant, her face filled with love, William's late wife. The sight broke him. William's composure shattered like glass, a sound escaping his chest that was half sob, half prayer. He reached out with shaking hands, but stopped short. afraid to touch the tiny picture as though it would crumble to dust. "It's her," he whispered, tears sliding down his cheeks. "It's her. It's you." Emma stared down at the photo, her lips trembling. She had never known her mother's face, never had a memory of her, and yet here it was, carried around her neck all this time, close to her heart. The realization struck like lightning. She wasn't just a lost child. She was loved once, deeply, fiercely, enough for someone to give her this piece of themselves before the world tore it away. "Mom." Mason breathed, leaning closer to the locket. His small hand touched Emma's gently. "That's our mom." Emma's tears finally fell, hot against her frozen cheeks. For the first time, she let them fall freely, because for the first time, she wasn't crying alone. But just as the warmth of reunion began to seep into the room, a new shadow stretched over them. William straightened suddenly, his face hardening, his tears drying into something sharper. "If this pen had survived," he said, his voice turning steely, "then someone knew you survived too. And if the fire wasn't an accident, then whoever tried to erase you might not be finished." The words chilled Mason's blood. He grabbed Emma's hand tighter, as though he could shield her from enemies he didn't even understand. Emma's gaze flickered to the window, where the snow whipped harder, and for a moment she imagined dark figures lurking just beyond the glass. Mrs. Peterson stepped forward, her voice trembling. "Sir, there were whispers after that night, rumors that the fire was set by someone close, someone who wanted control of your empire. If she's alive, then someone will want her gone again." William's jaw tightened. "Then they'll have to go through me." His voice carried a quiet, terrifying promise. "And this time, I won't be caught unprepared." He turned to Emma then, his steel-hard expression softening into something fragile, almost reverent. "Emma," he said, his voice breaking, "you're not just some lost child. You're my daughter, my blood, and I will burn the world down before I let anyone hurt you again." Emma's chest ached at the words. For so long, she had been unwanted, unseen, passed over by strangers on cold streets, to be claimed so fiercely, so unconditionally. Felt like stepping into sunlight after years in shadow. Mason leaned closer, wrapping both arms around her thin shoulders. "I told you," he whispered, fiercely, his voice trembling with emotion. "You're my sister. I knew it the moment I saw you." The three of them sat in the glow of the fire, father, son, and daughter, bound together by blood, by loss, and by a future that would no longer let them hide from the past. Outside, the snowstorm raged, but inside, the mansion was filled with something it hadn't known in years, the sound of family. Mason's laughter broke through Emma's tears. Emma's trembling voice filled the silence with words she never thought she'd say, and William's vow to protect them both wrapped around them, like a fortress. For in that small silver locket, with its sapphire heart and faded photograph, a secret buried for years had been revealed. And with it, a broken family was made whole again, not without scars, not without enemies still lurking in the dark, but with a love strong enough to face them all.